Hey everyone, welcome to Yogaland's Yoga Teacher Companion. I'm your host, Jason Crandell. Today we are going to talk about transitioning into Chaturanga. So this is the third part in a Chaturanga-based series. We've looked at maximizing safety in Chaturanga. We've looked at alternatives and modifications to Chaturanga. If you haven't checked out those episodes, you want to do so for sure. This episode will stand on its own, but I think that those other episodes will be really helpful for you. So I want to take on really three different things. Two different methods of lowering to Chaturanga from plank. And then I want to show you my preferred method for jumping back to Chaturanga and some of the drills, if you will, that I like to provide students when they're learning this method, okay? What we're not gonna talk about is whether or not it's safe to jump back to plank. It is. There's this kind of old tale of it's safe to jump back to Chaturanga, but it's not safe to jump back to plank. And oftentimes when you see a comparison between these two, you'll see someone comparing jumping back to Chaturanga well versus jumping back to plank not well. So suffice to say, if you jump back to plank with skill, it's as safe and probably much easier to do than jumping back to Chaturanga. We did do an episode with Robin Capobianco a long time ago where she talked about measuring ground force reaction in a kinesiology lab between jumping to Chaturanga and jumping to plank. So I'm going to reference that here so that we don't have to kind of get bogged down to that conversation. So there's a little discussion about whether or not when we lower down to Chaturanga from plank, we should shift forward or not. And what I want to do is I want to give you my thought, which is both shifting forward and not shifting forward when you lower from plank to Chaturanga, they're good options to do it. They're just a little bit differently. They're going to affect you a little bit differently. To me, I think they have different pros and cons, but both are completely reasonable ways to move from plank to Chaturanga. It just depends on what you are looking to actuate. Now, I do want to first show, before I show those two, I want to show you how you do not go from plank to Chaturanga shifting forward, okay? So I'm gonna show you how, if you do wanna shift forward, how you wanna do that. But first I wanna kind of just clean it up and say, well, if you are gonna shift forward to go into that transition, let me show you what not to do, okay? So the two different methods, let's just kind of get a feel for it first. The two different methods, the shift forward and the not shift forward. We'll look at it here, and then I will show how not to do it, and then we'll break some stuff down, okay? So not shifting forward means I am on the ball of my feet, okay? So I'm in plank, I'm on the ball of my feet, my hands are more or less under my shoulders, they can be a little bit forward of that. And for here, to lower to Chaturanga, I just lower straight down, okay? So when I lower straight down, in the not shifting forward method, my shoulders are going to shift forward a little bit relative to my hands, but I'm not shifting forward from the ball of the feet to the toes. I'm staying on the ball of the feet to that whole transition, okay? So that is the not shifting forward method. And then the shifting forward method, I'm in plank on the ball of my feet, and to shift forward, as I lower down and bend my elbows, I'm shifting forward to the tip of my toes. So this is the shift forward method, okay? Now, here's how you do not ever want to do that method. You don't want to shift forward with straight elbows. So you would not do it like this, everyone, okay? We'll remove this from the conversation. You wouldn't shift forward and then bend the elbows. That's bad news. Because if I shift forward from the ball of my feet to my tiptoes, I'm hyperextending my wrist, okay? So if you use the shift forward technique, which I'm gonna break down a little bit more here in a moment, you simultaneously bend the elbows as you shift forward, okay? So let's look a little bit more in detail at those two techniques and how I experience them differently. And then I want to encourage you to experiment with them and have your students experiment with them, because they're both, when done sensibly, mechanically viable techniques, okay? So if I do not shift forward, if I stay on the ball of my feet and I essentially just bend the elbows, my shoulders are still going to go forward of my hands. We don't ever want to be in Chaturanga where the hands are in line with the shoulders, okay? It doesn't give you, when you lower down and the elbows are in line with the shoulders, the hands are in line with the shoulders, you don't have a good angle of support in the humerus, right? Imagine me right now, everyone, imagine me trying to push heavy weight away from me with my hands here versus my hands here. This is way harder. This is just not a good, efficient place to transmit force. So even when you're not shifting forward from the ball of the feet to the toe, you are always going to shift forward the shoulder relative to the hand. So again, I'm staying on the ball of my feet. I'm not shifting forward there. And as I lower down, my chest and my shoulders are coming a little bit forward of my hands. So when I lower down, if I go all the way to Chaturanga, right? If I go to here, my hands are in towards the side ribs. They're not super low, which I'm going to show you in the next technique. They're a little bit higher, okay? Now, what do I like about this method, right? To just plank, bend the elbows, Chaturanga. What I like about it, to be honest, is it's easier. It doesn't take quite as much strength. We're going to see in a moment when you shift forward, you have to have a little bit more strength and control in the shoulders themselves. It's a little bit harder. So when I bend the elbows and just lower down, my body isn't progressing through space as much. I'm just going down. I'm not going forward and down. So when I'm just going down instead of forward and down, I don't have as much motion to control, which means it's an easier transition. There's just a lesser amount of space that my body travels because it's going down instead of down and forward, which means I don't have to work quite as much and it's already a difficult pose. What I don't like about it quite as much is then I'm still on the ball of my feet when I go to transition to upward facing dog. So if we assume, and again, it is an assumption that we're going from Chaturanga to up dog, because that's often how we do it. If I lower down to Chaturanga on the ball of my feet, then I have to, by some mechanism, flip my feet. And there are different mechanisms to do it. But if I'm in Chaturanga and if I haven't shifted forward, I'm on the ball of my feet. Okay? That's not bad, but then the transition to upward facing dog, I'm going to have to do some sort of step over or foot flip or some other transition. Okay? So there's a pro, there's a con, but it's a totally reasonable way to do it. Now, the shift forward technique. I said a moment ago, you would never shift forward from the ball of the feet to the toes while keeping the elbows straight. That's just ridiculous. Just don't put it in your social media profile. It's a non-option. But if you go from the ball of the feet and you shift to the tiptoes as you bend the elbows, as you lower down, then that shift forward technique, I'll show it again, okay? Then I'm not hyperextending my elbows, okay? The other thing about this shift forward technique is you go through more range of motion. It almost takes, those of you a little bit more familiar with the gym, you end up in this more like low row position. If you don't shift forward, your hands will be a little bit higher. We don't want them way up here, but they'll be a little higher. They'll be probably more like chest. But if you do shift forward, you're going through more range, and it's almost like you're going from an arm elevated position to a low row. So when you shift forward, you're going to end up with those elbows tucked into the side body, and the wrists are going to be aligned a little bit more with the bottom ribs, or a little bit closer to core, so you end up a little further down. I'm going to show it one more time. So I'm bending the elbows, I'm shifting to the tip of the toes as I come forward, and I'm ending up with my arms in this lower row position. So what do I like about that? Well, what I like about it and what I don't like about it is the same, which is it's harder. So you can take that either way, right? You can take that as an upside or a downside, but if I don't want to exert that much for my chaturanga, I don't want to do it. If I do want to work a little bit more by going through a greater range of motion and ending up in that low row position, I think it's a little bit harder, but if you can execute it and you're up for it, you probably get a little bit more opportunity for strengthening a greater range of the shoulder girdle in doing so. The other thing that I do like about it is it sets the foot for up dog, because you're going from the ball of the foot to the tip of the toe, which means for up dog, you don't have to flip the feet. They've already made that transition, okay? So let's see, I'll turn around so you can kind of see my feet a little bit better, right? So when I make this shift forward, everyone, I'm going from the ball of the foot, I'm coming down, I'm on the tiptoes, so then it's a much easier transition for up dog, right? I'm already here. I'm already on the tiptoes, which means up dog is a much easier rollover, okay? Now, let's get to jumping back. I'm just gonna show you the method that I prefer for jumping back. Now, again, I am not like divined with the singular perspective on jumping back, but even the language jumping back, I think needs to be reassessed. Because when we quote unquote jump back from chaturanga, all of our force, all of our weight is distributed from the hands back towards the feet. We're kind of going this one direction. What we're always trying to do to balance motion is to create some counter motion to the dominant motion. So when you jump back to chaturanga, the dominant motion is going to be body weight back and down. But to slow that down and to balance it out and make it a little bit more skillful, we want something to go forward. We want something to be actively moving forward to counter that weight that's jumping back, okay? So I'm gonna show you how I do this, and it all starts with two components of the setup, okay? When I put my hands on the floor to jump back, number one, I'm gonna put my hands way further forward than is typically or conventionally done. And number two, I'm gonna get lower than most people do. So what we'll see when people jump back, and again, I want this to be a very nonpartisan thing. This really is how I prefer to do it. And I think this is a really balanced, skillful way of executing it. But again, I'm not gracing you with a single perspective, okay? So what happens here is we'll typically come down, we'll come into this forward bend, and usually people, before they jump back, their hands are under their shoulders, and their hips are kind of high. And so from here, we'll just kind of jump back to chaturanga, right? All good, totally fine, not my preference. So what I like to do, everyone, because I want to really accentuate the forward movement of the upper body to counterbalance the movement of the lower body. So what I do, everyone, is I set my hands further forward and I squat down lower. So let's say I've just come into my forward bend. Let's say it's I'm doing Surya Namaskar A, right? And I want to jump back, right? So what I'm going to do and what I'm going to usually do, everyone, is I need a little bit more space. So instead of starting at the very top of my mat, I'm going to start like 3/4 to the top of my mat. That's where my feet are going to be because I need somewhere to put my hands. okay? So I'm more here, and then from here, everyone, right, I come into this forward bend, right, I've folded forward, and then instead of going hands here and jump back, watch what I do. Like I said earlier, I do two things. I bend my knees more and I take my hands forward, right? So that's the setup. Instead of here, jump back, I'm here. Now with my hands further forward, what that's gonna let me do is it's gonna let me lean forward to counter my legs going back. I want my upper body going forward as my legs are going back, and my upper body can't go forward like that if I plant my hands directly under my shoulders. I have to take them further forward. So I'm gonna show that another time or two, and then I'm gonna show you the drill that might help you kind of start to feel this and think about it and experiment with it, okay? So I've inhaled, forward fold, I've exhaled, I've come down, I've done my halfway lift, and now I'm ready to jump back. Instead of keeping hips high, hands here, I bend the knees and base my hands forward, right? So this is all slow motion. So I bend my knees, I base forward. Now with my hands forward, right, what that's gonna let me do, and I'm going slow so I can exaggerate this, is it lets me take all of this motion of my chest forward to counter my legs going back. So now everyone, I want to show that one more time at speed, or a little bit closer to full speed. So I've reached up, I've come forward, I've lifted part way up, and then as I exhale, I base my hands forward, I get my hips low, and Chaturanga. So I'm accentuating the motion of the chest forward to counter the motion of the legs back. There's this little drill that I like students to do to really get a feel for this, okay? And there's really two phases to this drill. So one of the challenging things about transitioning or jumping back into Chaturanga the way that I'm advocating for is one of the things that's difficult is it might just be different. And so it kind of takes a little bit of time just so you get a feel for it. The second thing is, most of the time when we're jumping back to Chaturanga, we're doing it with rhythm, right? And so we don't quite have that much time to set up a new organization of the body of how to make this motion. So I like to get people to do this, everyone. So what I'll have people do is almost get in this like kind of short down dog, right? So you have a down dog, so this is really short down dog, right? And I've bent my knees deeply, right? So my hands are way forward. I'm in this bent knee squatty position, right? And so what I do here, this first few rounds, I should say, I don't even jump. So I keep my hips low. I don't want to bounce the hips up. I keep the hips low, and then I just come forward, right? I just kind of get this feeling get a feeling for students, or get a feeling within students of staying really low and accentuating this forward motion. So we start to get in our head that the jump back is actually about as much of a dive forward. Because if I can have an equal amount of dive forward and jump back, then I'm gonna be able to make a really smooth, graceful transition. So that's phase one. Now the second phase is really the same setup, but you give a little jump to the dive. And listen everyone, I don't wanna jump up, right? I just want to accentuate this feeling of students leading themselves and lunging themselves forward, okay? So I get the same setup, but I'll have people give a little jump to it. So look, I stay really low, I look forward, not down, and then I just kind of like dive myself forward. I'm barely jumping with my legs, but I'm just shooting myself forward. And the more I get a feel for that, the more I get a feel for that dive forward, the more that's gonna build the muscle memory. So now final time, I reach up, I fold forward, halfway up, and then boom, I'm here. And when students get this, or when you get this, It's so smooth, it's so integrated. It's a really nice, for me, evolution of skill and how we make these transitions, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this, this whole Chaturanga series. I think there's a lot here. Play with it, experiment, take the stuff that you like and it works for you, skip the stuff that doesn't really resonate. And if you haven't already, I would love for you to go to jasonyoga.com and join my newsletter. Okay, everyone, thanks for practicing. Have a good one.